We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This woman doesn't know what she just ate, but she says it was unusual and delicious.
Потому что мы все голодные, можно сказать. У нас же ничего в магазинах нет.
We're all hungry in this city, she says. We need more of these places. There's nothing in our stores or restaurants.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Instead of offering French fries, some restaurants across the country are now calling them freedom fries.
This is a tasty burger.
The first of the former McDonald's restaurants in Russia has opened in Moscow under a new name, which translates as tasty and that's it.
How does Russia, a country we're told is a gas station with nuclear weapons, have a subway station that normal people use to get to work and home every single day that's nicer than anything in our country?
And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought, corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us.
I was so shocked by it. I was so shocked by it.
I'm really hungry all of a sudden. You want some Burger King?
Yeah, I'll take some onion rings.
Hey, this tastes like shit. You guys make money off of this?
They're very popular, sir. A lot of people care about the environment and sustainability.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, this seriously tastes like dog shit, and you get people to buy it?
Hamburgers will decide America's future. So says Malcolm Kyeyune in a recent essay ruminating on the American journalist Tucker Carlson's recent visit to Moscow, where he famously, or perhaps infamously, purchased a burger at Russia's new McDonald's clone, Tasty That's It. Kyeyune sees Carlson's culinary adventure as reminiscent of Mikhail Gorbachev's decision to do an advert in which Russians would debate whether the fall of the evil empire was worth the introduction of fast food chains. Now the shoe is on the other foot, with Carlson highlighting how cheap food is in Russia in comparison to the United States, plagued, as is the rest of the West, with a cost of living crisis. But this latest fast food fight is really only the tip of the iceberg lettuce. Since the pandemic of 2020, a feeling of malaise has crept into the West. The feeling is palpable and encompasses everything from rising costs of basic necessities to a feeling that the culture is spiraling out of control to a questioning of our basic modus operandi. What happened, some ask, to our freedoms? In this week's episode, we want to discuss whether the West is spiraling into crisis. It feels like a lot of narratives are breaking down right now, and one crisis seems to open onto another like a matryoshka doll. With a highly controversial election on the horizon in November, and the Biden administration having failed to deliver on its promise of normality, is our ideological Berlin Wall starting to crumble? To talk about these issues, we're joined with essayist and journalist Malcolm Kyeyune, also friend of the show. I'm sure most listeners are familiar with Malcolm. So Malcolm, tell us a little bit about the burger theory of history.
Well, the burger theory of history was probably actually embraced by the Americans themselves. You not only had the Mikhail Gorbachev commercial for Pizza Hut, where you have these old, Soviet boomers saying, like, thanks to Gorbachev, we have economic chaos and, like, Russia is falling apart. And then some Soviet grandma says, well, thanks to Gorbachev, we can have toppings out to the very end of our pizza. And then, like, the American cuts in, like, Pizza Hut edge, like when you want to go to the edge of your pizza. But that's only half of the story of the burger theory of how societies rise and fall. The other half had less to do with burgers, actually, and more to do with ice cream, because there's a famous photo of Boris Yeltsin in an American grocery store and he's looking in sort of stunned silence and awe at the selection of ice cream, going, wow, I guess this hateful American capitalist empire, like, maybe it wasn't so bad as we heard. Because even though for the longest time we tried to say that, okay, the Soviet Union as a system, communism, socialism, these things were superior to the West because the West, like, it was chaos, it was inequality, it was a lack of planning, and so our system was better. But looking at all this ice cream, maybe your system was better. And this was incredibly appealing to the West, to have these people say, well, you know, maybe you guys are really cool and better than us. But Tucker Carlson's trip to Moscow recently very much illustrated that the shoe was on the other foot, as you said, Philip. Because the original point and what people really got worked up over was the idea that Tucker Carlson would interview Vladimir Putin, and that this interview would sort of, I don't know, brainwash people in the West into thinking Russia wasn't the evil empire. But the interview itself was kind of a sideshow in some ways, because as many people memed about, Vladimir Putin wasn't particularly interested in trying to sort of sell the West on Vladimir Putin or on Russia. Like, he didn't necessarily feel any urge to convince those who were skeptical. He basically followed his own whims and gave, among other things, like a 40-minute lesson on Russian history going back 1,000 years. So the Putin interview was kind of less culturally impactful than a lot of people either hoped or dreaded. But what was really kind of a smash hit, or a surprise hit even, was Tucker Carlson doing these very short, digestible clips of him doing several different things in Moscow, like walking around on the streets of Moscow saying, wow, these streets, I don't see a lot of people, you know, zonked out on fentanyl. That's pretty weird. Like, isn't fentanyl addiction normal? Isn't that what a normal country has? I mean, it's normal in America. Same with, he took a ride through the Moscow subway, and he said, like, the subway is pretty clean, like, the trains look like they work. There's not people smoking crack in the subway. That's pretty novel. And then finally, this was really sort of the coup de grace. He went to the now Siberian-owned, like, ersatz McDonald's, and he had a cheeseburger, or two cheeseburgers even, and, you know, a Coke and some fries. And he said, wow, this is pretty good. Like, the Russians have cheeseburgers just as we do. It's just that they're cheaper and there's no GMO food. And for whatever reason, this really, really kicked the hornet's nest. People tried exceedingly hard to use statistics and so on to prove that actually Russia is the evil empire. Like, Russia is super poor, nothing works, it's full of crime, like, the police don't come when you call them. And who do you really believe? Me or your lying eyes?
Yeah, the statistics thing, I might comment on that, because I put up some statistics on Twitter. I tried actually to do some PPP adjustments for Russia. There were some interesting results. I don't think they're as interesting as people were making out. Basically, I found that, you know, it certainly is pretty impressive. I think Tucker said he got his grocery shopping, as the Americans say, for 25% the price as he would have got in a city in America. And if you compare that, you know, the Moscow income to the New York income, which I thought was a fair comparison, the Russians are getting a pretty good bang for their buck in terms of their quote-unquote groceries. So I think Tucker's intuition when he went grocery shopping, I think the same probably holds for his burger adventures, was pretty good. That despite the lower wages in the city, that it still was a pretty good deal. If the country was substantially poorer on a food basis, you'd expect, you get 25% the price, but you only have an eighth the income or something. But really, what I found interesting about that whole debate, which was mainly kind of I'd say conservative, economically focused liberals, liberal conservatives, you might say, in DC at places like National Review and so on. What I found really interesting on that was they set their own benchmark so low. You'd think they'd say, oh, that's completely ridiculous. There's absolutely no way you can even compare the two. Rather, they were trying to argue Russia isn't better than us. Russia isn't richer than us. And that was such a strange thing because, look, no matter what you do with your crazy PPP adjustments or, if Tucker's intuition was right that for a relatively poorer country, you got a pretty good deal on groceries, I think he was, no one's arguing that Russia's richer than America. It's just not. So even the premises of the debate, in a sense, were absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, and on top of that, like some of the parts that were harder to quantify, like, okay, do you have drug addicts on public transportation, which is, maybe you can't really quantify that in dollars and cents, but in terms of, do I live in a functioning society or not? That stuff it's not irrelevant by any measure. And people were saying, well, the Moscow subway, it's just this Potemkin village, like the real problem is being hidden away. And it's like, okay, so maybe there are crack smokers in the Moscow subway, but they're only using like an invisibility cloak from Harry Potter. Like they're invisible, soundless, smellless crack smokers. Like it just became ridiculous. And the other thing here is, in some sense, the truth actually doesn't matter. We could put up a counterfactual here and say that, like, take North Korea. Let's say Tucker Carlson visited North Korea in 2002. At sort of the apex of, you had the Disney Channel, doing kids shows about pledging loyalty to the stars and tribes and so on. Like it wasn't wokeness back then. It was state-mandated patriotism. And it didn't really need to be mandated either because everyone was a patriot. Like it came natural to people. Even if North Korea was twice as rich as America, and North Korea had twice as big hamburgers as America in 2002. Tucker Carlson could bring back photographic evidence of the massive North Korean hamburgers. Nobody would believe him. They would simply say, yeah, well, you made it up. Because I know America is the best country in the world. I don't need proof. I don't need to see your photographs of the North Korean hamburgers and the North Korean prosperity. I know my country is better. I don't need to see the figures. The moment you have to try to say to people that no longer believe in the stories, in the mythology, well, look, if you consult these figures, you've already lost. It's too late at that point. And so we went, and this Tucker Carlson commented on this himself, that the trip to Moscow was really radicalizing. That's the word he used, radicalizing, in a way he did not expect going to Moscow. And that radicalizing aspect had nothing to do with him listening to some history essay from Professor Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and going, oh yeah, like I really agree with Yaroslav the Wise now. No, it was just the experience of seeing the evil empire up close and realizing that all of the things that America was supposed to be better at, America was better at 30 or 40 years ago. But now those things, they no longer existed.
Yeah, I think he hit a nerve because of the recent inflation. We don't want to have a totally economic discussion. We definitely don't want to get into the National Review habit of trying to get an exact purchasing power parity adjustment on a tasty that's it cheeseburger. But I think it's speaking to a lot of people. I mean, there was a Bloomberg article out like 2 weeks ago, which showed kind of a standard grocery store shopping receipt in America. And if you've lived there recently, even I lived there before the pandemic, it does feel like food's an awful lot more expensive. So I can only imagine what it means for it to have gone up even more. And just to give you some sense, I'll just read one or two items, but this is what most people see when they see inflation that maybe people with more of an economic or a macro brain don't really consider. Like orange juice has gone up from January 2020 from about $2.32 to $3.67 in October 2023. Six-pack of soda, $4.33 to $6.77. Coffee, $4.17 to $6.18. White bread, $1.35 to $2, something similar for eggs. I mean, these are increases that you just would look at your receipt if you're in any way income constrained and go, ouch, you know? So I think that, I just want to give the context there that the Americans have just gone through a massive cost of living crisis, a cost of living crisis that is very much so partly due to the war in Ukraine, which was the very reason that Tucker was there to interview the president of Russia. And so they're looking at this, and then they look at Russia and they go, they were supposed to be destroyed by a bunch of sanctions, but Tucker's telling me that tasty That's It burgers are cheaper, like substantially cheaper than McDonald's, and my ground beef has gone up from $3.89 to $5.23. So yeah, I mean, the US may, on every metric, still be richer than Russia, but it's an invidious consumption. It's an invidious comparison, not an absolute one. And they're saying, geez, we went into this war and everything like that, and we were told one thing, and a totally different thing has happened. I think that's really why that clip started to go around.
In what sense, Malcolm, do you think that the incensed reaction almost that I think we all saw on Twitter from Tucker Carlson's visit to the supermarket in Moscow, and also the Russian McDonald's analog. In what sense do you think that incensed reaction wasn't just the fact that he was showing life is okay and good and positive within Russia, which I think some people object to on the principle that it goes against their narrative that kind of Russia is a kind of an evil authoritarian place where people live kind of grim lives of kind of stoic poverty essentially, but also because it touched a nerve. The foundation of America's story is, or the foundation at least of its modern story, is one of consumerism, isn't it? It's this idea that the US is somewhere that you can consume a lot and at a high level of consumption, whether it be food from supermarkets or fast food joints, or whether it be like other consumer items. Americans have huge refrigerators compared to those we have in the UK. I mean, Americans have big TVs, and they always did. And, Americans have big cars that consume lots of gas. And this kind of consumer society, this idea of consumption being a good in and of itself, really traveled to Western Europe at least. And it became one of the founding principles. I mean, to the extent when the US went through one of its most kind of shocking and catastrophic events of recent years, the 9/11 attacks on the twin World Trade Center towers in New York. One of the suggestions that the then President George W. Bush made to the American people, it wasn't to kind of remain stoic and understand we'll get through this and we'll mourn for people. It was go buy things in shops, and I understand there was an economic need. He didn't need kind of panic. He didn't need people kind of saving and being frightened. But, this idea that you would go buy things in shops because that was the foundation of what Americans did. It wasn't like keep calm and carry on, as the British did in the war. It was keep calm and continue consuming. Whereas now we see videos of Russia, and actually they have a pretty good consumer lifestyle, it seems. They have... The supermarket, to me, it wasn't just that, the bill was cheap at the end of it. They had loads of stuff, if you actually watch closely, There's loads of fresh produce, loads of different options. You know, you can obviously buy 16 different varieties of white flour and, 100 different varieties of potato chips. And, they've got plenty of choice, plenty of freely available food. They have decent fast food shops. I mean, who knew that the Russians would be able to make mediocre junk food just as well as the Americans? Perhaps shouldn't come as much of a shock, but I think maybe it touched a nerve that the kind of the foundations of modern America, it was like, well, hang on a second, this is our thing. This is what we do, right? It's like, but these guys do it better. It would be like Sparta finding kind of more fanatical and well-trained, soldiers in ancient Greece somehow, right?
Yes, because at the end of the day, Americans have, in many ways, after the 1970s crisis at least, when the old sort of much more egalitarian America basically died, the new America that took over and that didn't really have the same sort of frontier mentality where you could just pack up your bags and leave, in the way that like America of the 19th century had. Like the new thing, the compromise, in the same way that the Soviet Union was founded on this millenarian, really quite, like, how do I put this? Like non-materialist communism, where people would transcend the limitations of the flaws of humanity, the limitations of human society, and turn into something more than humans. Like this was what you saw in the 1920s, which then was put on pause during the Second World War for obvious reasons, but then started dying by the 1950s, seriously. And after that, you had Nikita Khrushchev saying, we're going to bury you in the West. Like our Soviet system, sure, we're not going to become like new Soviet men because we can't figure out how to make that work. But we are going to outproduce you. We are going to show that communism is a much more efficient economic system than you. So while you're sort of cruising around in like 10-year-old cars or whatever, we're going to have airships or helicopters privately owned. We're going to have flying cars and, the best sort of washing machines that humanity can build.
He told Richard Nixon, when Nixon was vice president and visited Moscow, he told Nixon that we'll wave to you as we pass you by. Like he said, we'll say goodbye, right?
Yeah, and contrast this with the very early Soviet Union, where they tried abolishing Christmas because it's this, it's a capitalist, materialist institution and whatever. And then they realized that, like, their kids are just, like, their parents, most of them, they have kids, and their kids are kind of disappointed. And, a real Bolshevik should be able to transcend, like, these old petty bourgeois modes of, the oppressive nuclear family. But then they realize, oh, shucks, I'm human. Like, I'm a mom, I'm a dad. And I can't really step outside of that. So they abolish Christmas, and then they put in like this renamed, they have like this fig leaf of, well, this is a new Soviet Christmas. It's not like the capitalist Christmas, but it's just the same thing. Because like they can't deal with their children being disappointed. So transcending humanity falls by the wayside because like all of them are human. None of them can figure out how to transcend humanity. They're still jealous and, like all the things that humans are. So again, you turn from messianic millenarian communism, like the kingdom without tears, without sadness or death. And then you say, well, we're going to have better washing machines. Once you have a society that says, we're going to have better washing machines, you live and die by those washing machines.
So I think that point's worth highlighting on. So if we think of this in terms of kind of a tipping point, in a sense, I mean, we're not really saying here that America's got substantially poor and Russia's got really rich. We are saying that the Tucker Carlson thing activated something in people. It clearly did. I think we've kind of rationally explained what that is. But what you're alluding to here is that actually it's not really about how much burgers you stuff down your neck. It's actually, and how much those burgers cost, although that can be annoying. It's actually, this is almost the legitimation. This is a legitimation narrative about the economy. That if you reduce your economy, as you say, to washing machines in the Soviet Union, and we've been there for longer in the West, and America's been probably the society that pushed this out the quickest, then it's not really that you don't have any washing machines anymore. It's that you're trying to continuously hit the target. Legitimation narrative, in a sense, that you should be. So what's your sense that why is there something going wrong in the American legitimation narrative now? I mean, no one is starving and people can still eat loads of burgers, right?
Yeah, well, all of the problems that American society has, the massive homelessness crisis, the, drug addicts on the subway, like the feeling that law and order is breaking down, like the massive migration crisis, the forever wars in the Middle East, the fact that nobody, like everyone hates Congress. Congress has like a 10% approval rating now. People feel that the political system is rigged. They feel that their votes don't matter, and empirical research bears this out. Nobody denies that the US has this long litany of problems, but what people say is, yeah, well, we are still the only game in town. There is no alternative. Because on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the Empire of Evil, people, I don't know, like they eat their own shoe leather, like they're cannibals. They don't live like normal civilized people. So you can complain about all the junkies, but what's the alternative? Either pick between junkies or no hamburgers. So our system, for all its flaws, it's the best system in the world because it's the only system where you can get those hamburgers. People aren't mad that the Russians are beating us in the hamburger race. Like, where will we be in 10 years? Like, they'll have better hamburger technology. People are disappointed because all of the things that are bad and are getting worse, the excuse for why they are the only game in town has been revealed to be a lie.
So if Tucker Carlson's visit to Moscow, and specifically a Moscow fast food purveyor and a grocery store, has damaged the US sense of its own kind of national story, the sense of its own national self-worth in terms of the things that it does well as a nation, and there is really not much to replace that. How does that fit in with one of the other things that you've spoken about, which was the strange way in which Osama bin Laden's letter of America, which is now almost a quarter of a century old, suddenly went viral a few months ago on TikTok, where young kids were reading this and, whether it be through a kind of a lack of critical thought or whether it be through the general attractiveness of it, had, suddenly decided that they felt that it explained quite a lot and they were kind of advising other people just to sit down and read this. I mean, do the two sides of this link in any way, Malcolm?
Yes, I mean, they are two sides of a single sort of legitimation crisis for a society. And so for people who aren't familiar with the resurgence of Osama bin Laden's letter to America, this was a letter published by the New York Times, I think, republished by The Guardian at least, in 2002, if memory doesn't fail me. Something in the order of 9 months of the 9/11 attacks. And so there was like a brief debate about like whether it's appropriate to publish a letter by someone like Osama bin Laden, given, he was responsible, or so it was claimed, for the 9/11 attacks. But people, didn't really spend that much time discussing it, because what was the problem? Like, this is a historical document. It's good that it's out there. It's useful for people in a free democracy to be able to read this and form their own conclusions. So, of course, we're going to publish this letter describing why 9/11 happened. And, it remained unread for about 20 years, even more. And then it suddenly became massively viral. And as a response to it becoming massively viral, The Guardian deleted it because it was supposedly more dangerous. The wounds from 9/11 were far more fresh 20 years after being inflicted compared to nine months. What that speaks to is not that time works in reverse if you're like the family member of someone who died in 9/11. So things get more controversial the longer like time passes. No, it's that the West was self-confident in 2002. It was not self-confident 20 years later. So what was permissible for people to read, and you didn't expect them to get crazy ideas, for another generation, you couldn't be quite sure. And so the reason Osama bin Laden's letter to America circulated was for a specific and like a truncated part. Like, people didn't read the whole letter. They didn't care about the whole letter. They cared about him saying that, actually, we are mad at you, America, for Israel-Palestine. Like, this is why Muslims are mad at America. And people read that and said, oh my God, like, this guy that we've been taught is an evil guy, like a villain, a baddie. He was actually the hero all along. I don't consider that to be a particularly, how do I say it? Like, it's not a particularly nuanced or fair and balanced point of view. I don't think it's particularly correct either. And it's not a view these people would have had unless outside of the specific context in which this video went viral. And that context was essentially Osama bin Laden being the only guy on the playing field, the only guy on the football pitch, as it were, even attempting to offer an explanation for what all of these people were seeing playing out on, they were seeing the clips of maimed children in Gaza and so on social media. They were looking at the casualty figures. And there was nothing in like the Western story that could explain this. Because, and this is not really, I'm not making a polemical point. I'm not making a point of, how do I put this? Like, I'm not making some sort of value judgment. It is simply an accepted empirical reality that if you look at like the amount of civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip compared to Ukraine, the former is several orders of magnitude, like a ridiculous number of orders of magnitude, grander than the latter. And there's not really that much of an ability for politicians and pundits in the West to explain why one is a genocide or why China's treatment of the Uyghurs is a genocide, but Gaza isn't. Nobody has a real explanation. I'm not saying no such explanation exists. I'm not making a value judgment about that whatsoever. I'm completely agnostic about that. Because the point here is not what is correct. The point here is about legitimacy. And if you cannot explain something and people can't understand it, they look at the story being told about the West being the guardian of human rights and fighting against the evil empires like China and Russia who bomb hospitals and just practice all of these really evil things that go against international law. These discrepancies are extremely damaging for your legitimacy. And so Osama bin Laden, again, was the only guy offering some sort of like, okay, here is my narrative about why the West is acting in this way. And that speaks to a massive sort of legitimation crisis, because these people, they've never, like Boris Yeltsin in an American supermarket, that stuff happened 15 years before they were born. It doesn't matter to them. And they've never really experienced the America that wasn't like basically in a sort of permanent crisis. They've never seen an America before like this recent bout of serious inflation outside of like zero interest rate policies. They were, 5 years old or whatever when the great financial crisis happened. I was 19. So I remember the world, like the West that expected to have more hamburgers than the other guy. For them, for Zoomers, Generation C, that stuff doesn't mean anything. They've never had such expectations. But what they have been taught are all these, liberal values. And that things has, like, belief in that has really, really become quite hard, even for people who want to believe in them. You have to do a lot of doublethink at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think to talk about the Osama bin Laden phenomenon, which I agree with you, I think it was way too, it was way too skated over and ignored. I think the reason is, as you emphasize, it's an age problem. The people who do the talking on these issues, the youngest of them are our age, probably in their 30s, and we just go, oh, they're doing weird stuff because they're woke or something like that. And, kids can be woke and kids can be weird and all that, we get it. But, once it passes a certain point, you sort of are just an old man going, oh, what the kids believe doesn't mean anything. Like, at a certain point, what the kids believe does mean something, and you're just being kind of an old codger if you insist that it doesn't. But I think to understand the Osama bin Laden thing, you have to understand that the Gaza war, for whatever reason, probably a combination of social media and what you said, that these kids have been brought up ultra-liberal in schools and so on. They've taught, actually, as well, to racialize an awful lot of stuff. And if you racialize the Gaza-Israel conflict in a crude way, you come away with one set of answers, obviously. And I think this has basically led them into a very unusual position where I have a poll here from Harvard Harris that shows that in America, and I want to emphasize this to our British and European listeners, Americans tend to be far, far more pro-Israeli than Europe. But in America, 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds say that in the conflict they support Hamas more than Israel, not Palestine, Hamas more than Israel. So there's definitely been, and of course that is due, again, the old codger response to this is like, how can they not understand what Hamas is? Fine, okay, but like stop making moral judgments for a minute and try and understand what's going on. Because, as you say, there is no alternative framing for these young people. They first of all go, well, I sympathize with what appears to me to be the victim, especially the victim in the poorer racial minority. And then it's very, very easy to slip from that into Hamas, especially given the fact that, all this kind of media is bombarding them, conflating the two in terms of casualties and so on. So that's I think that's where it kind of creeps in. And then once there's a very subtle thing going on here, I think, which is that, societies all have a kind of Manichean view of the world, a world of good and evil. And there's always somebody who's designated as evil, rightly or wrongly. If a substantial portion of your population, or even a substantial portion of your youth, starts identifying with the entity that is considered evil, where does it end? And so if Hamas is considered evil, and they've already, as we might call it, taken the Hamas pill, it's only one more step to take the bin Laden pill.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the bin Laden thing was very interesting because, again, like this was the big, like this was Darth Vader. This was the main villain of the millennial generation in the West. And you could maybe sort of say, oh yeah, like I'm edgy, so I say evil, be thy my good. And some people, a very vanishingly small minority, said, oh yeah, I'm with bin Laden because I like evil. But nobody thought it even possible to sort of flip the script around and say, well, you know, this guy that you say is evil, he's actually the good guy. And what people need to understand is that the Western culture that we live in, it's not the first culture in human history. Like, we've had a lot of different cultures, most of which no longer exist. So we have various intellectual, historical, empirical tools to diagnose, to troubleshoot these things, almost like you have a television that doesn't turn on. And so this particular Osama bin Laden thing, it's not, wow, the kids are just crazy. There's got to be like radiation or something. No, there's a specific term for what's going on here. And that is the process by which cultures are propagated from one generation to another is called mimesis. And essentially, mimesis is the same sort of manner in which a child learns to speak a language, which is you look at your parents and you imitate them. That's how cultures are also a learned thing. And so once people start going, oh my God, Osama bin Laden, like, he's the good guy, I'm realizing now that I've been lied to, that is a catastrophic breakdown of the process of mimesis. That is a failure for the older generation to actually carry over their own sort of cultural frames of reference here towards the younger generation. And so, like, if you have a kid, you put out the kid in the woods and he doesn't learn to speak, like, it's a pretty easy sort of mechanical process to understand. Like, okay, you don't teach that kid to speak English, nobody puts in the work, and then when he's 10, he can't speak English. Like, it's not a mystery, it's just a failure. You have to do something, nobody's done it, so it hasn't been done. And this is happening now in the West. And moralizing about it, it's really quite beside the point. Like, again, put out the kid in the woods, don't teach him English, and then say, well, I think English is a great and beautiful language. Well, maybe it is, but it's kind of not relevant. Like, this, again, is a quite easy mechanical process. You want someone to speak a language, you teach someone to speak a language. If you don't teach him, he doesn't learn. And it doesn't matter if English is then like a colonial language or a beautiful language or an ugly language or a bad or a good language. It's like the work hasn't been put in. And so the transfer from one generation to another hasn't occurred. And once you have these breakdowns of mimesis, which have happened repeatedly throughout history before, what you tend to get is a real massive failure of like a social failure, compounding social failure. And what you also get, generally speaking, like you get a lot of revolutions. So one famous example when mimesis broke down in a very systematic way was in, Russia at the start of the 19th century, the 20th century. Why? Because you had all of these people living out in sort of these villages, and then they get to the towns because Russia is industrializing. And the culture of the Russian village, it's no longer like adapted to living neck and neck, like packed like sardines in some dirty factory town, working not in the fields, but in some factory. Like, the failure to actually carry on peasant culture once people no longer live in peasant villages, it's pretty total. And a lot of really chaotic consequences follow from that.
Just to understand this process better, Malcolm, why would that happen? Why would that failure occur in somewhere like Russia? Why was there a failure in one place and not the other? And why do you believe there's a failure in the United States or in the broader West now?
All transitions from peasant society to industrial society necessarily involve like a breakdown in mimesis, for the simple reason that like we're no longer peasants. We don't think like peasants. We don't act like peasants. Like that would be very weird if we in the 21st century acted like, 16th century, 18th century English peasants. So I sense that like what you're really asking here is like, why was the process so explosive in Russia compared to the British example where it was more drawn out, even though it was like problematic and you had cultural critics writing about like the massive sort of transition mentally people had to make? Well, and the answer there.
Yeah, I mean, there was, poetry and politicians and philosophers all, considered these issues in Britain, but it didn't lead to a kind of a mass societal freakout and an explosion of kind of violence and revolution and hatred, which we saw in Russia. I mean, there may be cultural reasons for that in Russia, but specifically, on the issue of mimesis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because I think, if you're saying that we're seeing a breakdown of this in the US now and drawing it, an analogy with Russia and some other kind of pre-revolutionary societies, I think it's important to kind of, draw out and be a little bit specific about, what it is, right? It's
the reason things went really pear-shaped in Russia compared to Britain, like if you really want to sort of pare it down, it's because industrialization in Russia was much more compressed. It was much less of a natural process and much more of a, how do I put this? Like it was a centralized process that was extremely sort of traumatic and played out over a single generation. Which means that like it's a much more dramatic breakdown in mimesis because, again, you're experiencing all of these massive shifts that might have taken the English 80 or 90 years in 15 or 20 years. Obviously, that's going to be... It's like riding a roller coaster. If you go through the roller coaster in 2 minutes or 10 seconds, like it's the same roller coaster, but the impact of G-forces on the human body is going to be quite different.
Okay, so we're seeing kind of this bubble up to the surface now, or at least that's what it appears to me. We're talking about having a discussion perhaps of the young man, Air Force member, I guess, who set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy, not in any coy way. He really lit himself on fire and died. I mean, I'll just give my impression of this and the responses to it. I think that the response among older people, again, this feels to me like it's not me, it's the kids that are wrong sort of vibes, and dismissing anything that comes out of anyone under 30, which is just it's a classically poor mistake to make, especially when we talk about rapid social change or potential even for social unrest leading going right up to the scale of potential revolution or anything like that. My impression of it was people wanted to kind of pathologize this issue, and just say, oh, he's crazy or whatever. And like crazy people do crazy things sometimes, sure. And if you're gonna, light yourself on fire, I don't think you're probably the happiest bunny in the field. But, this is something that in the past we have taken very seriously when we see it in other societies. Obviously, the most obvious example of that was the Buddhist monk who lit himself on fire in protest of the Diem government in Vietnam, which began the end of the Diem government and Diem's assassination in Vietnam. We also probably recall in more recent days that the self-immolation of a shopkeeper, I think in Egypt, correct me if I'm wrong, Tunisia sparked off the Arab Spring. So when we see these images come from elsewhere, we go, wow, when people start lighting themselves on fire, not for some random reason, but for stated political reasons, that's usually a signal that politics in that country is reaching some sort of a tipping point of some sort. As I said, we've tried to pathologize that. Now, I understand that for psychological reasons. I also understand it from kind of a, almost public security point of view. You don't want to advertise the teen suicides too much, or loads of teenagers start committing suicide. I get it. But at the same time, there has to be a space to look at that and say, is this part of something else, as we say, with this breakdown in narrative structure that seems to me to be becoming more and more intense, a lot quicker. It all seems to be kind of happening quicker. So what's your sense of the self-immolation that we saw recently?
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing. I debated with some people in America when the Osama bin Laden thing was occurring, because at that point it was really clear that we had a breakdown of sort of legitimation in the eyes of a lot of young people. And if one looked at all of the people saying, wow, my eyes have been opened by Osama bin Laden, I've been lied to my entire life. These weren't leftists, most of them. Like, I come from the left. The left is massively overrepresented by people with college degrees in specific, like, urban centers. And on TikTok, it was a lot more heterogeneous, I should say. Like, some of these people you could tell, yes, these people have the social sort of symbols, habits that they could be a part of the left. But maybe even the majority didn't. But when I was discussing this, they said, okay, so even if it's true that young people no longer believe in the viability of the Soviet Union or in socialism, they don't take scientific communism seriously, or the American equivalent in this case. Like, they no longer believe in anything motivating the existence of the Soviet Union. So what? Like, what's gonna happen? Like, they're all just gonna sit at home and play video games, right? At that point, and this was, 4 months ago or something, I was very doubtful that they would sit at home and play video games. Because, and this goes particularly hard if you're young. If you're an older guy, you can sort of coast along on a sort of detached irony, like nothing matters, I don't care, look at me. Like, this is very easy for like Gen Xers and millennials. And this is also, there's an biological explanation for this almost, which is as you get older, you produce less testosterone. So you become less violent by default. Even if you are a violent criminal, once you reach your 40s, you stop being a violent criminal, just almost by default in most cases. This is not true for a guy that's 21 years old. Like, everything is fighting against taking a detached view. If you're a 21-year-old guy or 25-year-old guy, a lack of meaning, a lack of sense of like why you exist, why your society looks like it does, that is intolerable to a lot of people. It is so intolerable that the the alternative, which is creating meaning forcefully, using violence, if that's what it takes. That's almost the default solution in a lot of cases. That was my sense a couple of months ago, and this self-immolation, to me, really illustrates that this is where America is heading. Because of the inability for liberal society to really justify the claims to believing in liberalism or human rights or having more hamburgers or whatever, people are bereft of meaning, and they will use forceful, extreme measures, in some cases, to create that meaning. And this is only one of the consequences you can expect in a failure of mimesis, failure of state legitimacy, as we're seeing in the US. The fact that this guy was a active duty guy in the serving in the Air Force, that is a catastrophe for the US military. It's an unmitigated disaster, which is also the sense I've gotten from talking to people serving in the military right now. This is the problem, the last thing anyone in the US needed right now. And to put that into context, you have to understand that after the very contentious 2020 election and the inauguration of Joe Biden, the US military essentially entered a period of, I wouldn't say purging, but somewhere close. It began before COVID, really. And it was then motivated in terms of, basically, we have a lot of white rage in this country. We have a lot of angry, maybe even fascistic domestic terrorists, and they love their guns, and they love their, opposition to abortion, and they love voting for this really bad guy, Donald Trump. And these people are potentially a fifth column. So, and this anxiety, paranoia about essentially people in the military skewing right, being potentially politically unreliable, then married with COVID hysteria in a really toxic way, which led to maybe the US losing the equivalent of 2 divisions or something of military personnel from people not re-upping or demanding or being forced into administrative separation. Well, you never really got out of that. A lot of people in the US military really, truly regret that now, but they've not really been able to get over the paranoia, anxiety they have about, can we really trust all of these deplorables, quote unquote? The guy that lit himself on fire was supposed to be the reliable part of America. The part representing the future. Someone believing not in, white rage, but in platforming marginalized voices and whatever you want. And by all accounts, the guy that lit himself on fire, he was a progressive. He believed in decolonialism and all of that stuff. So if you can't have those people in the military, and you can't have people who vote for Donald Trump in the military, who are you left with?
You seem left with the very boomers that are isolating themselves from every single group. I mean, that's honestly what's going on here. They're isolating themselves on every single issue. They want to, it seems to me that they want to maintain as if an amber, a world that no longer exists anymore, where you can, be a liberal progressive and support Israel in their escapade in the Middle East without it getting too much. And you can also, oppose Russia, and you can make sure all the racists don't have any guns in the military or whatever. And they've just kind of tried to create this fantasy world, and what they've actually created is a mess. I mean, am I getting this right?
Yeah. I mean, and I've made this point, I'm pretty sure, in a previous episode here, but one of the problems the US military faced in the Middle East going into this like post-October 7 crisis is that even on their newest aircraft carrier, in a sort of hair-trigger scenario where this carrier could conceivably be involved in combat operations, in 2 hours from now or whatever. And this was the expectation going in. Like, we're sailing to the Middle East. We could be at war on extremely short notice. Even under those circumstances, the carrier was lacking hundreds of sailors. It was barely able to operate because of this massive manpower shortage. And all of the ships that then left are basically like they cannot be replaced because the US doesn't have enough sailors and it doesn't really have the capacity to do turnaround, like on maintenance, to actually have ships ready for Marines that are supposed to be ready to respond to crises. This was before this guy, who was supposed to be from the part of America that represented the future, not the past, said, I can't deal with this anymore. I am going to douse myself in kerosene and light myself on fire while yelling Free Palestine. Like, I will no longer be a party to genocide, is what this person said. So you already had a catastrophic, really like unworkable personnel deficit. And now you're making that much worse because that other half of America no longer believes in the mission, no longer believes in the society. This is not a minor thing. This is not like the Black Knight in Monty Python having one arm lopped off and saying, well, I've got 2 legs and I've got another arm, so like losing one arm, that's no big deal, right? This is the US military already having lost both arms and one leg, jumping around on 1 foot, and then having the last leg lopped off, essentially. I don't think anyone inside the institution really believes you can turn around the recruitment situation anymore. Like, who could you possibly even appeal to at this point? There's no one left. Like, maybe you could gather up all of the young people in America that vote for the Libertarian Party, like all 20 of them, and say, well, this is the American army now. But this legitimation crisis, it's not something for academics to discuss on some seminar or whatever, like, oh, well, this is all the world of ideas. No, it's something that is really going to ruin and has already in part ruined the ability for the US to basically sustain itself. The 2020 and that mess of an election, that was the Gaza war for the right. That was the time when like half of America stopped believing in America, essentially. And recruitment collapsed as a result. Well, now the other half has stopped believing in America. And there's like nobody has a plan to fix that. Like there's no possible way to fix it, to be honest.
I mean, it does seem like a legitimation crisis on multiple fronts. We're not taking it seriously. We don't want to see it. We don't want to look in the mirror. My sense is the older a person gets, the less they want to see this. The younger a person gets, the more it becomes obvious. And the older that you get, the more you're inclined to dismiss these things, as is the want of people who get older. So let's try and be objective about it. But where does it go? Look, I mean, I'll just give my kind of, working worldview up until actually, frankly, very recently. And my working worldview was basically that the West was entering a phase of stagnation, a phase, to use our Soviet examples, a phase of kind of Brezhnevian stagnation, where, everyone became kind of cynical with the system. Everyone is already kind of cynical with the system, and things kind of grind on. There's not that much hope in the future. What people forget an awful lot about the Brezhnev era is people party a lot. People drank a lot of alcohol under Brezhnev, and that wasn't always kind of like just sitting at the table and drinking yourself into depression, as kind of we were made out. If you actually read books on this, the Brezhnev era was kind of fun in a lot of ways. So that's kind of where I thought we were at. But, I think it's compelling to at least consider that there's evidence that there's a sort of an acceleration or a quickening going on here. But, where do you think this leads? Are we in, let's call a spade, are we entering a pre-revolutionary moment? It wouldn't be the first time that global conflict or a war, or dare I say, a war lost, would trigger a pre-revolutionary situation. What's your thinking on this?
I think it's a bit too late in the day to talk about a pre-revolutionary situation, honestly. The pre-revolutionary situation is the period of stagnation. It's the period where all of these flaws are kind of widely accepted, but people are they're sitting at home watching television. Nobody even gets the idea that anything matters, to the point where they go out and practice auto-cremation in order to get the movement going. Once you get the auto-cremation, that's when you move from, not Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote from the cartoon, that. Prairie dog or whatever. Stagnation is when he's run off the cliff, and you have this comedic moment where gravity doesn't work because he hasn't looked down yet. We were in that situation, I would say, since Trump descended the escalator, because what Trump did was say, we have all of these problems, the problems are getting worse, things suck, and nobody's talking about it, except for me. At this point, what we are actually seeing is a cascading crisis, a crisis cascade, in the sense that this is exactly what happened to the Soviet Union after people punched a hole in the Berlin Wall. In a normal time, so what if the Berlin Wall falls? Just send in the tanks, shoot a couple of protesters. It's not a big deal. What are they going to do? But the Berlin Wall happened at a time where all of this dysfunction and malaise and sort of contradiction within the Soviet system had built up to such an extent that it only took another straw to break the camel's back. The system no longer had the flexibility or the energy or the intellectual capacity to address any problems or put out any fires. Well, what do we have in the West right now? We have Joe Biden saying, these strikes against Yemen aren't working, but they're going to continue. Are you going to figure out something that works? No. We're going to keep doing something that we admit doesn't work. So the sum of all of this is there's this old saying that what can't be extended forever or what can't go on forever will simply stop at some point. Well, if the US empire can't be maintained sans a military, and I don't think any of you disagree with me when I say that, the entire US empire, the world, the trade system, all of these international institutions, they are not going to work unless the US has some sort of military credibility. But the US is on a trajectory where it simply can't sustain that military credibility just for personnel reasons. Just putting aside sort of own goals like bombing the Houthis without a plan. So that can't go on. And it's not going to go on for, we're talking here not decades, we're talking a couple of years. And so what I would simply say here is that it was the fall of the Soviet Union was quite unimaginable to people inside and outside the Soviet Union, because like nobody could even conceive what that would look like. And it turns out that what that looked like, especially during the 90s, was pretty horrible. So no wonder that people weren't dreaming about, the Yeltsin years before they happened. Like, who would dream about that? But we're in the same sort of quagmire. Like, we can no longer justify the system in any real systematic way. We can't really keep it going, because to keep it going, you need to be able to recruit people for the military. And to be able to recruit people for the military, you need to explain what kind of society they live in and why. You need to have legitimacy. We can't sustain that anymore. So I do think that people, like, things are going to fall apart. It's not going to be the end of the world or anything. Like, the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't the end of the world, nor was it the end of Poland or Russia or the Baltic states or, Czechoslovakia or anything like that. But nobody at this point has a plan to keep this stuff going for very much longer. And that's not even a secret anymore.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.